a black general punched by a racist cop, and the aftermath that shocked everyone. Imagine being in a parking lot, minding your own business, when an officer approaches, his tone hostile, his actions aggressive. Now imagine that officer, fueled by prejudice, throwing a punch at a decorated major general, a man who spent his life serving his country. How would you react in that moment? Have you ever been the target of injustice or seen someone else treated unfairly because of who they are? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to share where you're watching from. Subscribe to our channel to ensure you don't miss more inspiring stories like this one. The late afternoon's long shadows over the parking lot as Thomas Carter sat in his car, absently scrolling through his phone. Emily, his wife, was inside the grocery store, picking up their weekend essentials. Thomas leaned back in his seat, savoring the brief moment of calm after a hectic week. The hum of distant conversations and the occasional chirp of birds gave the place an almost serene atmosphere. The serenity didn't last. The sharp wail of a siren and the abrupt flash of red and blue lights in his rearview mirror jolted Thomas from his thoughts. A patrol car had pulled up directly behind him, engine rumbling. He straightened, his military instincts kicking in, scanning the scene for a reason. No one else was nearby. It was just him and the officer stepping out of the car. The officer moved with purpose, too much purpose. Nathan Hale's footsteps were heavy, his expression unreadable, but tinged with something that set Thomas on edge. As he approached, Nathan raised his baton and rapped it hard against the car window. The sharp thud echoed in the confined space, making Thomas flinch. "Roll down the window!" Nathan barked, his voice sharp, commanding, and devoid of courtesy. Thomas hesitated for half a second, then complied, lowering the window just enough to speak. "Evening, officer. Is there a problem?" Nathan's eyes flickered over Thomas, narrowing slightly as if sizing him up. "What are you doing here?" he demanded, ignoring the question entirely. "I'm waiting for my wife. She's inside," Thomas replied, keeping his tone measured. "Suspicious activity's been reported in the area," Nathan shot back, his tone dripping with skepticism. "Step out of the vehicle." Thomas blinked, taken aback by the abrupt escalation. "Suspicious activity?" he repeated, his brow furrowing. "I'm sitting in my car. That's hardly suspicious." "Don't make me repeat myself," Nathan interrupted, his voice growing more hostile. "Out now." Thomas felt a prickle of tension at the base of his neck. Years of military service had taught him to recognize a volatile situation, and this one was teetering on the edge. "Officer," he began carefully, "I'm not sure what this is about, but I haven't done anything wrong. I'm just—" Nathan cut him off with a sharp motion of his baton, pointing it toward the door. "Step out!" A few bystanders nearby had paused, drawn by the officer's raised voice. Thomas noticed one or two pulling out their phones, recording from a distance. The presence of witnesses did little to temper Nathan's demeanor. With a controlled exhale, Thomas unlocked the door and slowly pushed it open. He moved deliberately, hands visible, not wanting to give Nathan any reason to escalate further. As soon as Thomas stepped out, Nathan was in his face, his stance aggressive, his hand resting ominously on his holster. "Turn around." "Hands on the car," Nathan ordered. Thomas didn't move immediately. "Is this really necessary?" he asked, his voice still calm but edged with disbelief. Nathan took a step closer, his face inches from Thomas's. "Did I stutter?" Thomas set his jaw and turned, placing his hands on the roof of the car. The officer's hands were on him immediately, patting him down with unnecessary force. Thomas winced as Nathan pressed harder than needed, his actions less about procedure and more about intimidation. "What exactly are you looking for?" Thomas asked, his tone tight but controlled. "Whatever I need to find," Nathan snapped, his voice cold. He leaned closer, almost hissing into Thomas's ear. "People like you think you can sit wherever you want, do whatever you want, without consequences." Thomas froze at the words, a chill running down his spine. There it was, the unspoken bias laid bare in a single sentence. A murmur rippled through the small crowd that had begun to form. "What's he doing?" a voice whispered. "That's too much," another said. Nathan glanced briefly at the gathering spectators but didn't back down. If anything, their presence seemed to irritate him further. "Stay back," he barked, one hand lifting to wave them off. "This doesn't concern you." The onlookers didn't move. Instead, a young man holding his phone stepped closer, raising it higher to get a clear shot. "We're just making sure everything's fair," he said, his tone challenging. Nathan's eyes flickered with annoyance, but his focus remained on Thomas. He grabbed Thomas's arm and twisted it behind his back. "Let's see some ID," he demanded. Thomas winced but kept his composure. "It's in my pocket," he said evenly. "Don't move," Nathan growled, reaching into Thomas's jacket. As he did, something fell to the ground, a small plastic card that caught the sunlight as it landed. One of the bystanders bent down to pick it up, curiosity flashing across their face. A beat later, their eyes widened. "Hey!" the man called out, holding the card up. "This guy's Major General Thomas Carter!" The murmurs from the crowd grew louder, and Nathan's head snapped toward the man. For the first time, uncertainty crossed his face. He snatched the card from the bystander and glanced at it. His grip tightened as he read the name. Nathan's expression darkened, but his actions didn't change. Instead of backing down, he doubled down. "Military or not," he spat, tossing the card to the ground. "You're still under suspicion." Thomas turned his head slightly, meeting Nathan's glare. "Suspicion of what?" he asked, his voice low and steady. Nathan didn't answer. His grip on Thomas's arm tightened instead, his knuckles white. The crowd stirred uneasily, their murmurs growing louder. One woman stepped forward, her voice cutting through the tension. "Leave him alone. He hasn't done anything." Nathan spun toward her, his free hand reaching for his baton. "Stay back," he roared. The situation was unraveling fast. Thomas could feel it, the air thick with potential violence. He glanced at the crowd, at the phones recording every moment. He knew this was far from over. "Officer," Thomas said, his voice firm despite the mounting pressure on his arm, "you're making a mistake." Nathan's eyes flickered with something, anger, frustration, maybe fear, but he didn't let go. And then, just as the tension threatened to snap, a familiar voice rang out. "Thomas!" Thomas turned his head, relief and concern washing over him as he saw Emily walking toward them, her shopping bag swinging in her hands. Her eyes darted between her husband and the officer, narrowing as she processed the scene. "What's going on here?" she demanded, her voice sharp, authoritative. Nathan hesitated, his grip loosening slightly as he registered her presence. The moment of hesitation was brief, but it was enough to shift the dynamic. The crowd pressed in closer, their phones still recording, their voices growing louder. And in that instant, Thomas knew that this confrontation had only just begun. The next moments would not only change Thomas's life, but Nathan's as well. Nathan Hale's grip on Thomas Carter's arm was firm, bordering on aggressive. The air between them felt heavy, crackling with unspoken hostility. "What exactly do you think you're doing here?" Nathan demanded, his voice sharp and dripping with accusation. Thomas turned his head slightly, keeping his expression composed. "I've already told you. I'm waiting for my wife. She's in the store." "That's not good enough," Nathan snapped, stepping closer. His tone wasn't just dismissive, it was laced with something more, animosity that Thomas couldn't ignore. Thomas straightened slightly, his military posture showing through. "Officer, I've done nothing wrong. You have no reason to." Nathan slammed his hand against the car door, cutting Thomas off mid-sentence. The metallic thud drew gasps from the small crowd beginning to gather. "Don't lecture me," Nathan growled. "Step back and keep your hands where I can see them." Thomas, though calm on the surface, felt his muscles tense. The situation was spiraling out of control faster than he could predict. "I'm cooperating," he said evenly, refusing to back down. "But this aggression isn't necessary." Nathan's eyes narrowed, and without warning, he reached for the car door handle. Thomas instinctively moved to stop him, gripping the edge of the door before it could be yanked open. "Don't touch my car," Thomas said firmly, his voice low but commanding. Nathan leaned in closer, his knuckles whitening as he tried to pull the door open. "Are you resisting?" he barked, loud enough for the gathering onlookers to hear. "I'm not resisting," Thomas replied, his voice steady despite the officer's provocations. "I'm protecting my property. There's nothing in this car for you to see." The brief tug-of-war ended with Nathan stepping back, frustration etched on his face. He reached for his radio, the static crackling as he pressed the button. Unit 47 requesting backup at Westside Market parking lot. Possible suspect refusing to comply. Send additional units. The words hung in the air, and Thomas exhaled slowly. Backup. This was escalating too quickly. From the edge of the growing crowd, a voice cut through the tension. "He's just sitting in his car," a young man shouted, holding up his phone. "You can't treat him like this." Nathan turned sharply, his eyes locking onto the source of the interruption. "Stay out of this," he barked, his hand briefly hovering near his holster. "This is a police matter. It doesn't look like he's doing anything wrong." Another voice chimed in, a woman this time. Nathan's jaw tightened. He turned back to Thomas, the vein on his temple pulsing visibly. "Get your hands on the hood now," he ordered, his tone brooking no argument. Thomas hesitated, his eyes flicking to the crowd, then back to Nathan. I've already complied with everything you've asked. You're taking this too far. Nathan stepped closer, his face inches from Thomas's. You don't get to decide what's too far, he hissed. The young man with the phone stepped forward. Hey, you can't keep harassing him. We're all recording this. Nathan's head snapped toward the man. Back off or I'll arrest you for obstruction, he shouted, his voice rising with barely contained rage. Thomas took a deep breath, willing himself to stay calm even as his own patience began to fray. Officer, this is unnecessary. You're creating a scene over nothing. Nathan ignored him, focusing instead on the crowd. I said back off, he yelled, his voice echoing across the parking lot. His hand was now fully on his holster, fingers curling around the grip. The crowd didn't disperse. Instead, more people started filming, murmuring amongst themselves about the officer's behavior. The young man with the phone held it higher, his voice steady. You're way out of line, man. Just let him go. Nathan turned back to Thomas, his face flushed with anger. You think you're some kind of hero, sitting here like you own the place? Thomas raised an eyebrow, his calm demeanor only seeming to fuel Nathan's frustration. I don't think I'm a hero, officer. I think I'm a man sitting in his car, minding his own business. Something you seem determined to make impossible. Nathan's nostrils flared, and he took another step closer, practically looming over Thomas. The tension was palpable, the kind that could ignite with the smallest spark. At that moment, the distant wail of another siren pierced the air. Thomas glanced toward the sound, catching sight of another patrol car speeding into the lot. His heart sank. This wasn't de-escalation. It was about to get worse. The second car screeched to a halt, and two more officers stepped out. One was a tall, broad-shouldered man with a no-nonsense expression, clearly ranking higher than Nathan. The other looked younger, almost hesitant as he surveyed the scene. What's going on here? The senior officer asked, his tone curt as his eyes flicked between Nathan and Thomas. Back up, Nathan replied curtly, gesturing toward Thomas. He's refusing to comply. Thomas spoke up before the senior officer could respond. I'm sitting in my car waiting for my wife. That's all I've done. The senior officer frowned, his gaze narrowing as he studied Nathan. Is that true, Hale? Because it looks like you've got half the neighborhood filming you. Nathan stiffened, his lips pressing into a thin line. He resisted when I asked him to step out, he said defensively. The younger officer shifted uncomfortably, his eyes darting to the crowd, which was growing louder by the second. They're saying he didn't do anything, he muttered under his breath, but loud enough for Nathan to hear. Nathan turned on him sharply. Whose side are you on? The senior officer raised a hand, silencing the brewing argument. Enough, he said firmly, then turned back to Thomas. Do you have ID? Thomas nodded slowly. It's in my pocket. May I retrieve it? The senior officer nodded, and Thomas carefully reached into his jacket, pulling out his wallet. He handed over his ID, and the officer's eyes widened slightly as he read the name. Major General Thomas Carter? He said aloud, his tone shifting to something more formal. Nathan's face hardened, a flicker of something unreadable passing through his eyes. The senior officer handed the ID back to Thomas and turned to Nathan. Hale, we need to talk. Now! Nathan opened his mouth to protest, but the senior officer cut him off with a sharp glare. Not here. Step aside. The tension in the air seemed to ease slightly as Nathan reluctantly backed away, his hand finally moving away from his holster. But the crowd wasn't satisfied. The young man with the phone stepped forward again, his voice loud and clear. He's been harassing this guy for no reason. You need to deal with him. The senior officer raised a hand toward the crowd, his tone calm but firm. We're handling it. Please, step back. Thomas exhaled, his shoulders relaxing slightly as the immediate danger subsided. The crowd began recording more intently, and Nathan seemed to be losing control. Nathan Hale's frustration boiled over as he stood face to face with Thomas Carter. His knuckles turned white around the baton in his hand. I told you to get on the hood, he barked, his voice cutting through the murmurs of the growing crowd. Thomas stood his ground, his voice calm but resolute. I've done nothing wrong. You're escalating this for no reason. Nathan didn't wait for another word. He grabbed Thomas by the arm and yanked him toward the car, slamming him against the cold metal with enough force to draw gasps from the onlookers. Hands behind your back, Nathan ordered, already pulling out his handcuffs. Thomas winced but didn't resist, his body taut with controlled tension. What's the charge, officer? He demanded, his voice steady despite the physical discomfort. Nathan ignored him, snapping the cuffs onto his wrists with unnecessary force. The metal bit into Thomas's skin as Nathan tightened them aggressively. Let him go! A voice from the crowd shouted. Nathan turned sharply, his eyes locking onto a young man who had stepped closer, his phone raised high. "Step back now, or you're next." Nathan's hand hovered over his holster, a clear warning. The young man hesitated, but didn't back away completely. "We're all watching," he shot back, defiant. Nathan's hand darted to his gun, and he pulled it out in one swift motion, the barrel now aimed at the ground but ready to rise. "I said step back," he bellowed, his voice cracking with anger. The crowd recoiled slightly, but the phones remained steady, their cameras fixed on the scene. "Put the gun away," a woman shouted, her voice shaking but fierce. "You're out of control!" Nathan's gaze darted back to Thomas, who was now cuffed and leaning against the car. "Shut your mouth!" Nathan barked at the crowd, then turned back to Thomas. "You think you're untouchable, don't you? Sitting here like you own this place." Thomas met Nathan's glare, his expression unwavering. "This isn't about me sitting here. It's about you proving something." "What are you trying to prove, officer?" Nathan's jaw clenched. Without answering, he shoved Thomas harder against the car. The crowd erupted in a mix of outrage and fear. "Hey!" someone shouted. "You're going too far!" At that moment, the door to the nearby store swung open, and Emily Carter stepped out, holding a bag of groceries in one hand. Her eyes widened as she took in the scene, her husband cuffed and pinned against their car, the officer's gun drawn, and a crowd gathering like storm clouds. "What's going on?" she demanded, her voice cutting through the noise like a blade. Nathan didn't answer. His focus remained on Thomas, his grip on the cuffs tightening. Emily dropped the grocery bag and strode toward them, her heels clicking sharply against the pavement. "I asked, what's going on here?" she repeated, her tone icy and commanding. Nathan glanced at her briefly but dismissed her presence. "Step back, ma'am. This doesn't concern you." Emily's eyes narrowed. "That's my husband and you're assaulting him in broad daylight. Explain yourself." Nathan hesitated, his composure wavering for a moment before he snapped, "He's under suspicion." "For what?" Emily countered, folding her arms across her chest. "Waiting in his car? That's not a crime, officer." Nathan ignored her, instead focusing on securing Thomas further. His hands fumbled as he reached for his radio again. "You don't even know who you're dealing with, do you?" Emily said sharply, stepping closer. Nathan stopped, his eyes narrowing at her. "What's that supposed to mean?" Before Emily could respond, a metallic clink drew everyone's attention. Something had slipped from Thomas's jacket pocket during the scuffle, a small laminated card. One of the onlookers, a man in his late 20s, bent down to pick it up. He turned the card over, his eyes widening as he read it. "Holy crap," he muttered. "Major General Thomas Carter?" The crowd buzzed with murmurs, and the young man stepped forward, holding the card high for everyone to see. "This guy's high-ranking military." Nathan's head snapped toward the card, his expression darkening as he processed the information. "So what?" he growled, snatching the card from the young man's hand. He glanced at it briefly before tossing it to the ground. The crowd gasped at the blatant disrespect. Emily's voice rose, cutting through the commotion. "You've made a mistake," she said, her tone sharp with controlled fury. "A serious mistake." Nathan glared at her, his face flushing with frustration. "Step back, lady, or I'll have you arrested too." Emily didn't flinch. Instead, she reached into her handbag and pulled out her phone. She began dialing with deliberate calm, her eyes never leaving Nathan. "What are you doing?" Nathan barked. "Calling Commissioner Daniels," she said coldly. "You're done, officer." Nathan's eyes widened briefly before he masked it with a sneer. "You think I care about your connections?" Emily raised an eyebrow, her voice steady and cutting. "You will." The tension in the parking lot was almost suffocating now. The crowd had grown, their phones capturing every word, every gesture. Nathan's hand twitched near his holster, his authority unraveling under the weight of the moment. Thomas, still cuffed and pressed against the car, looked over his shoulder at his wife. "Emily, be careful," he said quietly, his voice tinged with both pride and concern. "I'm fine," she replied, her gaze locked on Nathan. He's the one who should be worried. But it wasn't Emily's words that shifted the tide. It was the small, overlooked card that had just exposed the truth. The murmurs in the crowd swelled as the young man who picked up the card turned it over, his jaw dropping in disbelief. He stepped forward, holding it up like a trophy. "Major General Thomas Carter," he shouted, his voice cutting through the tension. "This man's military." For a moment, everything froze. The name echoed in the parking lot, rippling through the crowd as heads turned and voices rose in shock. Nathan's eyes darted to the card, his expression hardening. "Give me that," he growled, snatching it from the man's hand. He stared at the words for a brief second before tossing the card to the pavement like trash. "So what if he's military?" Nathan snapped, his voice rising. "That doesn't put him above the law. You just attacked a decorated officer!" Another voice yelled from the crowd, louder and angrier this time. "You're way out of line!" Nathan ignored them, his focus solely on Thomas. His face twisted with irritation, his authority being chipped away by the second. "Your rank doesn't matter here," he said, his tone dripping with disdain. "Right now, you're a suspect like anyone else." Thomas turned slightly, the cuffs biting into his wrists. "A suspect for sitting in my car?" he asked, his voice calm but laced with sharp irony. Nathan stepped closer, towering over him. "I'm not going to let you or anyone else play me for a fool," he hissed. "Playing you?" Thomas repeated, his tone cutting. "I haven't said or done anything to justify this circus you're creating. You're spiraling because you're wrong, and you know it." Nathan's jaw clenched as he took a half step back, his fingers twitching near his holster. The crowd's outrage continued to grow. Phones raised, recording every second of his unraveling. Then Emily's voice rang out, clear and unwavering. "Enough!" Nathan turned toward her, the tension in his posture growing. "I already told you to step back, ma'am." Emily ignored him, her focus solely on her husband. She closed the distance, stopping just a few feet away. Her eyes moved to the cuffs on Thomas's wrists, then to the red marks forming where Nathan had gripped him. "Are you hurt?" she asked, her voice soft but steady. "I'm fine," Thomas replied, though the faint grimace on his face said otherwise. Emily's attention shifted to Nathan, her expression hardening. "Take those cuffs off of him. Now!" Nathan sneered, his hand tightening on his baton. "That's not how this works. Step back before you make things worse for yourself." Emily took a deliberate step forward. "You've already made things worse for yourself, Officer Hale. Do you even know who my husband is?" Nathan's face darkened, but he didn't respond. Emily pulled her phone from her bag, scrolling quickly before pressing a number. She lifted it to her ear, her eyes locked on Nathan. "Yes, Commissioner Daniels, please. This is Emily Carter." "Yes, Senator Adams's daughter." The crowd stirred at the mention of her name, and even Nathan faltered for a split second. Emily's voice was calm, measured. "I'm standing in the West Side Market parking lot. One of your officers just assaulted my husband, Major General Thomas Carter, in front of dozens of witnesses. You'll want to address this immediately." Nathan's face turned a shade paler, but his defiance remained. "You think dropping names is going to scare me?" he said, his voice edged with false bravado. Emily ended the call and looked directly at him. "I'm not trying to scare you. I'm holding you accountable. You crossed a line, and you know it." Nathan's composure cracked further. His voice grew louder, angrier, as if volume could drown out the reality crashing down around him. "You don't get to dictate how I do my job." "Your job?" Emily shot back, her voice sharp. "Your job is to protect and serve, not assault and intimidate. You've lost control, and everyone here sees it." The crowd erupted in agreement, their voices rising in unison. "She's right," one man shouted. "Take the cuffs off." Nathan's head swiveled toward the crowd, his frustration boiling over. "Back off, all of you!" he barked, pulling his baton from his belt. The gesture sent ripples of fear through the onlookers, but no one backed down. "Put the baton away," someone yelled. "You're embarrassing yourself." Before Nathan could respond, the sound of approaching sirens cut through the chaos. A second patrol car screeched to a halt nearby, and two officers stepped out. One of them was tall and broad-shouldered, his face set in a stern expression. He scanned the scene quickly, taking in the handcuffed man, the irate officer, and the restless crowd. The name on his badge read, Captain Hayes. "What the hell is going on here?" Hayes demanded, his voice cutting through the noise like a whip. Nathan spun to face him, his defensive posture immediate. "Back up," he said shortly. This man was resisting, and the crowd's getting hostile. Hayes raised an eyebrow, clearly skeptical. His eyes landed on Thomas, who stood tall, despite the cuffs and the pressure of the situation. "Who's this?" Hayes asked. "Major General Thomas Carter," Emily interjected before Nathan could speak. He was sitting in his car, waiting for me. This officer decided that was grounds for assault. Hayes's gaze shifted to Nathan, his frown deepening. Is that true? Nathan bristled. He resisted when I told him to step out of the car, he said defensively. Hayes looked unimpressed. And what was the reason for asking him to step out? Nathan faltered for a moment, searching for a response. Suspicious activity, he finally muttered. Hayes's frown deepened. Suspicious activity. For sitting in a car? Nathan's mouth opened, but no words came out. Hayes turned back to Thomas, his tone shifting to one of respect. Sir, are you injured? Thomas shook his head. I'm fine, Captain, but I'd like these cuffs off. Hayes nodded and gestured to the younger officer who had arrived with him. Get those off him. Now. The younger officer stepped forward quickly, his hands trembling slightly as he unlocked the cuffs. Thomas rubbed his wrists, the red marks visible under the parking lot lights. Hayes stepped closer to Nathan, his voice low but firm. Hale, step aside. We'll discuss this in private. Nathan hesitated, his face a mix of anger and humiliation. But Hayes didn't wait for his compliance. He turned back to the crowd, raising his hands. Thank you for your concern, everyone. We're handling the situation. Please step back and give us space. The crowd began to disperse reluctantly, but the tension in the air lingered. With his backup now on the scene, Nathan's authority continued to erode as the situation spiraled further out of his control. Captain Michael Hayes stood firm, his presence commanding. He had quickly assessed the scene, the restless crowd, the furious Emily Carter, and, most tellingly, the restrained yet composed Major General Thomas Carter. His focus shifted to Officer Nathan Hale, whose agitation was growing by the second. Nathan, Hayes began, his voice calm but firm. Uncuff him. Now. Nathan's jaw clenched as his gaze flicked between Hayes and Thomas. With all due respect, Captain, I'm handling this by the book, he replied, his tone defensive. Handling it by the book? Hayes repeated, incredulous. He gestured toward the crowd, the phone still pointed at them. Does this look like protocol to you? Because to me, it looks like you're dangerously close to losing control. Nathan straightened, his voice rising. I've got it under control. He was resisting, and this crowd. Hayes cut him off sharply. The only one escalating this is you. I'm not going to ask again. Release him. Nathan's nostrils flared as he tightened his grip on his baton. I'm doing my job. Just because he's some high-ranking officer doesn't mean... It means exactly that, Hayes snapped. And even if he weren't, your actions are out of line. You don't cuff someone without cause, and you sure as hell don't threaten civilians for recording you. Nathan's face flushed, but he didn't back down. He's suspicious. Sitting in his car, watching, waiting for his wife. Hayes interrupted, his voice growing colder. Do you even hear yourself? You've turned a routine interaction into a public spectacle. Step down, Nathan. That's an order. The tension between them was palpable. Nathan's hand twitched near his holster, and for a moment it looked as though he might relent. But instead of stepping aside, he took a defiant step forward. With respect, Captain, Nathan said through gritted teeth, you weren't here. You didn't see how he acted. Acted how? Hayes demanded. Calmly. Respectfully? Because that's all I'm seeing. Nathan's frustration boiled over. You're not listening. People like him always have an excuse, always play the system. That's enough, Hayes barked, his voice cutting through Nathan's tirade like a whip. You're out of line, Officer Hale. The crowd murmured louder, emboldened by Hayes's words. But Nathan wasn't finished. His hand moved to his holster, and in one swift motion, he drew his gun, pointing it toward the ground but clearly ready to aim. Step back, Captain, Nathan warned, his voice shaking slightly but still defiant. I'm not going to let you undermine me in front of them. The crowd gasped, and Emily took a step closer to her husband, her eyes narrowing with fury. Hayes didn't flinch. Put the gun down, he ordered, his tone deadly serious. Nathan's grip on the weapon tightened. I won't stand here and let him. Let all of them think they can get away with this. Hayes raised his hand slightly, his voice steady but firm. You're making a bad situation worse. If you don't holster that weapon right now, you'll leave me no choice but to remove you myself. The younger officer who had accompanied Hayes shifted nervously, his hand hovering near his own weapon. "Captain, do you want me to—" "Stay where you are," Hayes snapped, not breaking eye contact with Nathan. Thomas, still standing beside the car with his hands free, took a slow step forward. "Officer Hale," he said calmly, "you've already crossed a line. Don't make it worse for yourself." Nathan's eyes darted to Thomas, his expression a mix of anger and desperation. "You don't get to tell me what to do." "I'm not telling you what to do," Thomas replied, his voice even. "I'm giving you a chance to walk away with what little dignity you have left." Nathan's face contorted with rage. He raised the gun slightly and the crowd recoiled in fear. "Enough!" Hayes roared, stepping forward with authority. In one fluid motion, he grabbed Nathan's wrist and twisted it downward, forcing the weapon from his grip. The gun clattered to the pavement as Nathan staggered back, his balance momentarily lost. The younger officer rushed forward, scooping up the weapon and securing it. Hayes stood over Nathan, his face hard as stone. "You're done," Hayes said coldly. "Hand over your badge and your weapon, now." Nathan's eyes darted around, desperate for support, but all he saw were the judgmental stares of the crowd, the unwavering glare of his captain, and the stoic figure of Thomas Carter standing tall despite the ordeal. "I was doing my job," Nathan muttered weakly, but his words lacked conviction. "You've disgraced the badge," Hayes shot back, "and now you're going to face the consequences." The younger officer stepped closer, extending a hand toward Nathan. "Officer Hale, please," he said quietly. Nathan hesitated, his breathing heavy, his face pale. Finally, he reached up and unpinned his badge, handing it over with trembling fingers. Hayes took it without a word and turned to the younger officer. "Escort him back to the precinct. I'll deal with him later." The crowd erupted in murmurs as Nathan was led away, his head hanging low. Phones captured every second of his walk of shame. The once confident officer, now a symbol of disgrace. Hayes turned back to Thomas, his tone softer, but still serious. "I'm sorry for what happened, Major General. We'll ensure this is handled properly." Thomas nodded, his gaze steady. "I trust you will, Captain." Nathan Hale stood frozen, his breathing ragged, his eyes darting between Captain Hayes, the crowd, and Thomas Carter. His weapon had been confiscated, and his badge was now in Hayes's hand. Yet, even in his defiance burned in his gaze. "Turn around, Hale," Hayes ordered sharply, holding out the handcuffs. Nathan didn't move. "You're making a mistake," he spat, his voice venomous. "I was doing my job. These people—" "Enough!" Hayes barked, cutting him off. "You've escalated this beyond reason. Your behavior is a disgrace to the uniform. You're under arrest for assault and misconduct." "Turn! Around!" Nathan's jaw tightened, his fists clenching at his sides. "You're going to regret this, Hayes," he snarled. "All of you are. You think you're siding with him? With them? You have no idea. Turn around or I'll make you," Hayes snapped, stepping forward. From the crowd, a voice interrupted. "Wait!" Everyone turned toward a young man holding his phone high. "You all need to see this," he shouted, walking closer. He tapped his screen, and a video began playing, his voice trembling with anger as he narrated. "This is what happened earlier. Look!" The video was clear. It showed Nathan shoving Thomas against the car, twisting his arm with excessive force, and cuffing him without cause. Then came the sound of Nathan yelling at the crowd, and worse, pulling his gun. Gasps rippled through the onlookers as they watched the scene unfold. "That's not protecting anyone," the young man said, his voice growing louder. "That's abuse." Nathan's face turned a deep shade of red, but he refused to back down. "That video doesn't tell the whole story," he shouted, his voice cracking under the strain. "He was resisting. They were hostile." Hayes didn't even glance at the phone. "It tells me enough," he said coldly. "You've crossed every line, Hale. Don't make this harder than it already is." Nathan took a half step back, his eyes darting between Hayes and the younger officer standing nearby. His defiance turned desperate. "You're throwing me under the bus for a crowd of nobodies," he hissed. "This is a goddamn setup." Thomas, who had remained silent until now, took a step forward. His presence commanded attention, his voice calm but firm. "No one set you up, Officer Hale. You created this mess yourself." Nathan spun toward him, his anger boiling over. "Shut your mouth. You think you're untouchable because of your rank. You think you can just waltz in here and— Enough, Hayes interrupted, his voice low and deadly. Hale, you're done. Turn around. Nathan's eyes flickered with indecision. His chest heaved as he glared at Hayes, but the captain's unwavering authority left no room for negotiation. Finally, with a growl of frustration, Nathan turned, his movements jerky and reluctant. Hayes stepped forward and cuffed him with swift precision. The metallic click of the cuffs was a sound that silenced the crowd. You're going to regret this, Nathan spat over his shoulder as Hayes tightened the cuffs. All of you, every last one of you. Hayes ignored him, gesturing to the younger officer. Take him to the car. Don't let him say another word. The younger officer nodded, stepping forward to grab Nathan by the arm. But Nathan wasn't finished. You think you've won? He shouted at the crowd, his voice raw with anger. You think you're the heroes here? You'll regret this. Every single one of you will regret this. His voice echoed across the parking lot, but the crowd didn't flinch. If anything, they stood taller, their phones still raised, capturing every moment. Get him out of here, Hayes ordered, his tone like ice. The younger officer dragged Nathan toward the patrol car, his protests fading as the distance grew. The crowd murmured amongst themselves, their outrage palpable, but their relief growing. Hayes turned back to Thomas, his expression a mixture of professionalism and regret. Major General Carter, he said formally, I apologize for everything that happened here. Officer Hale will face the full consequences of his actions. Thomas nodded, but didn't respond immediately. His eyes followed Nathan as he was pushed into the back seat of the patrol car, still fuming and muttering under his breath. Emily stepped closer to her husband, her voice soft but firm. This isn't over, she said. I know, Thomas replied quietly, his gaze still fixed on the car. Hayes stepped aside, speaking briefly into his radio, before addressing the crowd. Thank you for your cooperation, he said, his voice steady but authoritative. The situation is under control. Please disperse. The crowd began to thin out slowly, though many lingered, still recording or talking amongst themselves. Thomas turned to Hayes. This isn't just about one bad officer, he said, his tone measured but heavy with meaning. Hayes met his gaze, understanding the weight of the statement. I know, he said simply. And we'll deal with it. But for now, let's get you and your wife home. But for Thomas, this wasn't just about one bad officer. It was about a system that allowed it to happen in the first place. Thomas Carter sat in his office, the glow of the computer screen reflecting in his tired eyes. The events of the day replayed in his mind. The unwarranted aggression, the humiliating cuffs, the venom in Nathan Hale's words. Something about the officer's rage felt personal, as though it went beyond a routine abuse of power. He logged into a secured database, his military credentials granting him access to personnel records not readily available to the public. Typing Nathan Hale into the search bar, Thomas waited as the system combed through its archives. A profile appeared on the screen. Nathan's service record showed an unremarkable start, routine training, basic commendations. But as Thomas scrolled further, his eyes narrowed. There was a name that kept appearing in the notes, Stephen Hale. The connection clicked instantly. Stephen Hale had been under Thomas's command during a particularly challenging mission years ago. Memories of that mission resurfaced with painful clarity. Stephen had been brash, impulsive, and unwilling to follow orders, a dangerous combination in the field. His recklessness had jeopardized the entire unit during a high-stakes operation, forcing Thomas to report him. The investigation that followed was swift. Stephen had been court-martialed and dishonorably discharged, his military career over before it had truly begun. Thomas remembered the incident vividly, not just because of the risks Stephen had posed, but because of the fallout. He had been accused of being overly harsh, even though the evidence had been irrefutable. Thomas leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. Nathan wasn't just a bad cop with a superiority complex. He was a man carrying a deeply personal grudge. Later that evening, Thomas sat across from Captain Hayes in a dimly lit office at the precinct. The atmosphere was tense but focused. I need everything you've got on Nathan Hale, Thomas said, his tone leaving no room for argument. Hayes raised an eyebrow. I thought you were done with this, he said. Hale's already in custody. What more are you looking for? Thomas leaned forward, his eyes sharp. This isn't random. Hale targeted me. I need to know why. Hayes nodded reluctantly, pulling a folder from his desk. We started looking into his record as soon as the complaints rolled in, he said, sliding the file toward Thomas. Thomas opened the folder, skimming through pages of disciplinary notes. Each entry painted a clearer picture: excessive force, harassment, insubordination. But one detail stood out. Nathan's behavior had grown significantly worse after Stephen's discharge. This is about his brother, Thomas said, the realization heavy in his voice. Hayes frowned. His brother? Stephen Hale, Thomas explained, his tone clipped. He served under me years ago. Reckless, insubordinate, he endangered lives. Reporting him wasn't a choice, it was a necessity. Hayes leaned back in his chair, absorbing the information. And Nathan blames you for what happened. Thomas nodded. He's been carrying that resentment for years. Today wasn't just about a random stop. It was personal. Determined to confirm his suspicions, Thomas visited the military archives the next day. A deeper dive into Stephen's file revealed a string of failed attempts to reintegrate into civilian life. The dishonorable discharge had been a stain he couldn't erase. Job rejections, financial struggles, and eventual criminal charges painted a tragic but inevitable picture. One report stood out: a bar fight that ended with Stephen in critical condition. Nathan had been listed as the one who found him afterward, and the note suggested that incident had been a turning point. He blames me for the failure and the fallout, Thomas murmured to himself. The pieces fit together too neatly to ignore. Nathan wasn't just angry. He was consumed by a need for vengeance, a misguided attempt to rewrite history by taking Thomas down. That evening, Thomas met with Emily at home. She listened intently as he recounted what he'd discovered, her expression hardening with every word. So, this was never about you being in the wrong place at the wrong time, she said. He's been waiting for this opportunity. Thomas nodded. I don't think it's a coincidence that he found me. He's been keeping tabs, or maybe it's pure luck. But either way, he saw a chance and took it. Emily's fists clenched. And he thought he could use his badge to settle a personal vendetta? Exactly, Thomas said grimly. Emily looked at him, her determination evident. What's the plan? I need to confront him, Thomas replied, his voice steady. Face to face. He needs to know that this stops here. Thomas knew that resolving this wouldn't come through revenge, but by confronting the man who had let hatred consume him. Thomas Carter stepped into the dimly lit interrogation room, his expression unreadable. Across the table, Nathan Hale sat cuffed, his shoulders rigid, his eyes sharp and defiant. The two men locked gazes, the silence between them heavy with unresolved tension. Captain Hayes stood near the door, arms crossed. You asked for this meeting, he said, addressing Nathan. Make it count. Without another word, he exited, leaving the room cloaked in an uneasy quiet. Thomas sat down slowly, his posture composed but firm. He let the silence linger, watching Nathan's expression shift from defiance to unease. Finally he spoke, his voice calm but pointed. You wanted to take me down. Why? Nathan scoffed, leaning back in his chair. Don't play dumb, he said. You know damn well why. I want to hear it from you, Thomas pressed. Nathan's jaw tightened, and for a moment he looked away. But when he turned back, his eyes burned with anger. Stephen, he said bitterly. You destroyed him. Thomas didn't flinch. I saved lives. Stephen was a danger to the team, to himself. His actions left me no choice. No choice? Nathan snapped, leaning forward. You ruined his career. You branded him a failure. Do you know what that did to him? To us? Thomas met Nathan's fury with unwavering calm. Your brother's mistakes were his own, he said evenly. He disobeyed orders. He endangered the mission. He put lives at risk. I reported the truth. What happened after was out of my hands. Nathan's fists clenched, his knuckles white. You didn't just report him. You made him a scapegoat. You could have handled it differently, but you didn't care. You threw him to the wolves, and he never recovered. Thomas's voice hardened. You're right about one thing. He didn't recover, but not because of me. Stephen couldn't take responsibility for his actions. He blamed everyone but himself, and you've spent years feeding that blame instead of facing reality. Nathan's face twisted with frustration. Don't lecture me about reality. You don't know what it was like to watch him fall apart, to see him lose everything, and then his voice cracked, and he quickly composed himself. He was my brother. I had to pick up the pieces. And in doing so, you let his failure define you, Thomas countered. You've carried his resentment like it was your own. Look at where it's brought you, Nathan. Sitting here, shackled by the same bitterness that destroyed him. Nathan's breathing grew heavier, his anger faltering under the weight of Thomas's words. I was trying to make it right, he muttered, his voice low. To make you pay for what you did. By assaulting me. By abusing your authority? Thomas asked, his tone sharp. You didn't make anything right, Nathan. You only proved that you're no better than the man you think I am. Nathan's defiance cracked, his shoulders sagging. He looked down at the table, avoiding Thomas's gaze. For a long moment, neither man spoke. Then quietly, Nathan admitted, I don't even recognize myself anymore. Thomas leaned forward, his tone softening slightly. You don't have to let this define you. But you do need to own what you've done. The path you've chosen isn't one Stephen forced you onto. It's one you chose. Nathan's head snapped up, a flicker of anger returning. Easy for you to say. You walk around with your medals, your rank, none of this touches you. Thomas's voice dropped, firm but steady. You think this doesn't touch me? I've carried the weight of every decision I've made, including the one about Stephen. I've questioned it, doubted it, but I know it was right because it saved lives. Can you say the same about your choices? Nathan stared at him, his expression unreadable. Slowly, the anger in his eyes gave way to something else. Shame. I wanted to make him proud, Nathan said, his voice barely above a whisper. But all I did was make things worse. Thomas nodded. Then stop. Take responsibility. It's the only way forward. Nathan exhaled shakily, his shoulders slumping further. And what happens after that? You face the consequences, Thomas said plainly. But you also get a chance to start over. That's more than some people get. Nathan didn't respond immediately. He seemed to be wrestling with his thoughts, the weight of his actions pressing down on him. Finally, he looked up, his expression resigned. I don't know if I can fix this, he admitted. Maybe not, Thomas replied. But you can stop it from getting worse. The room fell silent again, the tension between them replaced by a heavy understanding. Nathan slumped back in his chair, his eyes dull. I'll confess, he said quietly, to everything. Thomas nodded once, standing to leave. He paused at the door, glancing back at Nathan. You're not the first man I've seen consumed by anger, but you don't have to be the last. With that, he stepped out, leaving Nathan alone with his thoughts. However, confession wouldn't absolve Nathan from facing the full consequences of his actions. The sound of footsteps echoed in the hallway as Nathan Hale was led from his holding cell to a quiet room where he would sign his formal confession. His wrists were uncuffed but felt heavy, as if the weight of his guilt had become physical. Waiting inside was Captain Hayes, arms crossed, and Thomas Carter, standing by the wall with a calm but resolute expression. Nathan hesitated at the doorway, his shoulders tense. Hayes motioned him inside with a curt nod. Let's get this over with, Hale, he said firmly. Nathan stepped forward, his gaze briefly meeting Thomas's before falling to the table. A stack of papers and a pen awaited him. The silence in the room was thick, pressing down like a physical force. Hayes broke it. These are your statements. You'll admit to the assault, the misconduct, and the abuse of your authority. Once you sign, it goes on record, and you'll face the disciplinary and legal consequences. Do you understand? Nathan nodded silently, his fingers twitching as he sat down. You're sure about this? Hayes pressed. There's no going back. Nathan's voice was quiet but steady. I'm sure. Hayes slid the papers toward him, but it was Thomas who spoke next, his tone measured but direct. Nathan, signing this isn't the end of your responsibility. It's the beginning. Nathan looked up, his brow furrowing. You think this fixes anything? It won't change what happened to Stephen. No, Thomas replied calmly. It won't. But it's not about fixing the past. It's about preventing the future from being worse. You can't undo what's been done, but you can stop digging the hole deeper. Nathan's jaw tightened. And what if I don't know how to climb out of it? Thomas took a step closer, his gaze unwavering. You start by admitting you're at the bottom. That's what this is. Acknowledgement. The rest comes one step at a time. Nathan exhaled heavily, picking up the pen. His hand hovered over the paper for a moment before he began to write, each stroke deliberate, as if he were etching his failures into stone. The room remained silent as Nathan filled out the statement, line by line. When he finally set the pen down, he looked at Hayes. Is that it? Hayes picked up the papers, scanning them briefly. For now, the rest will be handled by internal affairs and the courts. But you've done the right thing. Nathan let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. The right thing, he muttered. A little late for that, don't you think? Thomas stepped forward, his voice steady. Late isn't the same as never. You've made mistakes, Nathan. Big ones. But this is a step. A small one, but a step nonetheless. Nathan looked up, his expression conflicted. Why do you even care? After what I did, you could have buried me. Hell, you probably should have. Thomas's tone softened, though it still carried weight. Because I've seen men like you before. Men who let anger consume them until they can't see a way out. Some of them never find it. But the ones who do, they're the ones who choose to stop fighting everyone else and start fighting for themselves. Nathan's face twisted with emotion, a mix of shame and reluctant understanding. And you think that's me? I think it can be, Thomas replied. If you let it. For a moment, Nathan said nothing, his eyes fixed on the table. Then slowly, he nodded. I'll try, he said quietly. But I don't even know where to start. Start by owning your mistakes, Thomas said, and then start rebuilding, piece by piece. Hayes, who had been silently observing the exchange, stepped forward. This doesn't erase what happened, Hale. But it's the right move. For you, for the department, for everyone involved. Nathan stood, his movements deliberate, but weighed down by a somber acceptance. What happens now? Hayes' tone was firm, but not unkind. You'll be processed. The courts will determine your sentence, and your badge is permanently gone. After that, it's up to you. Nathan nodded, his expression resigned. He turned to Thomas, his voice low but genuine. I'm sorry, he said. For everything. Thomas inclined his head. Apologies matter, but actions matter more. Show it, Nathan. As the officers escorted Nathan out of the room, the door closed with a soft but definitive click. Thomas stood in silence, his gaze lingering where Nathan had been moments before. Hayes broke the quiet. Do you think he'll follow through? Thomas exhaled slowly. I don't know, but he's taken the first step, and that's more than I expected. But as Nathan began his journey of accountability, Thomas knew his own battle against systemic failure was far from over. The precinct was unusually quiet, as Nathan Hale's nameplate was removed from his locker. Officers passed by with muted glances, some filled with disapproval, others with discomfort. Nathan was no longer one of them. His badge had been permanently revoked, his career in law enforcement over. Days after his confession, Nathan faced formal charges of assault, misconduct, and abuse of power. The district attorney's office prepared its case, supported by overwhelming evidence. Videos from the parking lot, witness testimonies, and Nathan's own written admission. There would be no plea for leniency. The public demanded accountability. For the department, Nathan's downfall was more than a single officer's failure. It was a public reckoning. Pressure mounted from all sides as activists, community leaders, and the media demanded answers about how such behavior had been allowed to persist. In the wake of the uproar, Thomas Carter found himself at the center of a movement he hadn't sought but couldn't ignore. The confrontation in the parking lot had become a flashpoint, symbolizing the broader issue of systemic abuse within law enforcement. Standing before a packed room of reporters and cameras, Thomas addressed the press for the first time since the incident. The atmosphere crackled with anticipation, every word he spoke carrying weight. I want to be clear, Thomas began, his voice steady and firm. What happened to me was not an isolated incident. It's a reflection of deeper flaws within the system, flaws that affect countless others who don't have the privilege of a rank or a platform to defend themselves. The reporters scribbled furiously, cameras clicking as Thomas continued. This isn't about one bad officer. It's about a culture that allows prejudice and abuse to fester unchecked. Nathan Hale's actions were his own, but the environment that enabled him, That's on all of us to address. A journalist raised her hand, her voice cutting through the murmurs. Major General Carter, what do you believe needs to change? Thomas didn't hesitate. Transparency, accountability, and proper oversight, he said. We need comprehensive reform in training, hiring practices, and internal investigations. Officers must be held to the highest standard, not protected by silence or fear of exposing wrongdoing. Another reporter asked, "Do you think Nathan Hale's case will bring real change?" Thomas met the question head-on. It can, but only if we don't stop here. Hale's prosecution is a start, not a solution. The real work lies in preventing this from happening again. Behind the scenes, the police department had already initiated an internal review. Captain Hayes, now acting as a liaison between the department and the community, led a series of tense meetings with civic leaders. In one such meeting, a fiery exchange broke out. "How many more Hales are there in your ranks?" demanded Angela Wright, a prominent community organizer. "How many others are out there abusing their power without consequences?" Hayes held her gaze, his voice calm but firm. "I won't pretend we're perfect, but we're committed to finding the answers and making the necessary changes." "You're committed now," Angela shot back. "But what about before? Would you have acted if this hadn't been caught on camera?" The room fell silent, the weight of her question pressing down on everyone present. Hayes took a deep breath. "I can't change the past," he admitted. "But I can promise that moving forward, we will act swiftly and decisively. Hale's case is proof that we're willing to hold our own accountable." Angela crossed her arms, her expression skeptical but thoughtful. "We'll hold you to that," she said. Weeks later, new policies began to take shape. Mandatory de-escalation training, stricter oversight of officer conduct, and the establishment of an independent review board were among the first changes implemented, but progress didn't come without resistance. Some officers viewed the reforms as a betrayal, a concession to public pressure. Tensions simmered within the department, with murmurs of discontent growing louder. Hayes addressed these concerns directly during a roll call meeting. "If you can't uphold the integrity of this badge, if you see accountability as a threat rather than a necessity, then this isn't the place for you," he said bluntly. "We're not just fixing the public's trust, we're fixing our own house." For Thomas, the aftermath of the incident was a mix of relief and resolve. He had done his part to expose a problem, but he knew the journey was far from over. In private conversations with Emily, he voiced his lingering frustrations. "This isn't about me," he said one evening, his tone reflective. "I had the rank, the connections, and the witnesses to fight back. Most people don't. They're left powerless, with no one to believe them." Emily placed a hand on his arm. "You've made people listen," she said. "That's more than most get to do." "It's a start," Thomas conceded, "but there's still so much more to do." As Nathan Hale's trial approached, public interest surged. His former colleagues testified about his pattern of misconduct, revealing a troubling history that had been ignored for far too long. Angela Wright, watching the trial unfold, reached out to Thomas. "You've got people's attention," she said. "Use it. Push for more." Thomas nodded. "I will," he promised. The house was quiet as Thomas Carter sat at the dining table, a cup of coffee cooling in his hands. Emily entered the room, her expression a mixture of pride and concern. She had the past weeks had taken on him. Late nights of planning, relentless meetings, and the weight of a system he felt compelled to confront. "Did you see the news?" Emily asked, sitting across from him. Thomas nodded. "Hale pleaded guilty this morning. It's over for him, at least legally." Emily tilted her head, studying his face. "And for you?" Thomas set the mug down, leaning back in his chair. "It's not over, not even close. This wasn't just about Nathan Hale. It's about what he represents. A system that's broken in ways most people can't even imagine. For every Hale, there's someone else waiting to take his place." Emily reached across the table, placing a hand over his. "And you've already taken the first step to change that. You've exposed the cracks. People are listening, Thomas. You can't stop now." Thomas sighed. "It's overwhelming. The problems are so deep, so entrenched. Even with all the changes they're promising, it feels like we're barely scratching the surface." "That's why you have to keep going," Emily said, her tone firm but encouraging. You've done what most people wouldn't dare to do. Stand up and shine a light on the truth. But this isn't a sprint. It's a marathon. He looked at her, his eyes tired but resolute. It's hard to feel like one person can make a difference in something this big. Emily's grip on his hand tightened. You're not just one person, Thomas. You're someone people respect. Someone who's proven that change is possible. You've turned your experience into a rallying cry for others. That's powerful. Thomas nodded slowly. It's not just about me, though. It's about making sure the people who don't have a platform, who don't have the rank or recognition, still get justice. How do we make sure that happens? Emily leaned back, her gaze steady. By refusing to let this become just another headline. By keeping the conversation alive, even when it's uncomfortable. Later that evening, Thomas sat in his office, reviewing proposals for community outreach programs. His phone buzzed and he glanced at the screen. It was a message from Angela Wright, the community leader he had worked with during the fallout of the Nathan Hale case. Let's talk strategy. The city council is ready to hear us, but we need to make a strong case for independent oversight committees. Can you meet tomorrow? Thomas replied immediately, agreeing to the meeting. As he set the phone down, Emily appeared in the doorway. You're still working? She asked, a teasing smile on her face. Always, Thomas said with a faint chuckle. Angela thinks we have a shot at pushing for civilian oversight. It's one of the big steps we've been aiming for. Emily walked over, leaning against the desk. See? Progress. It's happening, even if it's slow. Thomas nodded. It's just frustrating knowing how much resistance there still is. Some people think I'm attacking the whole system. They don't see that this is about making it better, not tearing it down. Emily's expression softened. Change always comes with resistance. But you've faced worse battles, haven't you? Thomas smirked. Fair point. Emily placed a hand on his shoulder. You've spent your whole life fighting for something bigger than yourself. This is no different, and you don't have to do it alone. Thomas looked up at her, gratitude in his eyes. You always know what to say. That's why you married me, she said with a grin. The next day, Thomas met with Angela and other community leaders to finalize their proposal. The discussion was intense, with debates over strategies, priorities, and messaging. We need to focus on accountability, Angela argued. If people don't believe the system can change, they'll never trust it again. Thomas nodded. Agreed. But we also need to highlight the positive steps being taken. Change doesn't happen overnight, but showing progress can build momentum. Another leader chimed in. What about training? Officers like Hale clearly weren't prepared for the responsibilities they carried. Training is important, Thomas replied, but it's not enough. There needs to be a cultural shift, a focus on empathy, community engagement, and integrity. That's what builds trust. By the end of the meeting, the group had crafted a comprehensive plan to present to the city council. As they parted ways, Angela stopped Thomas at the door. You're a good ally to have in this fight, she said. I'm just doing what needs to be done, Thomas replied. Angela smiled knowingly. And that's what makes you different. That evening, Thomas and Emily sat on the porch, watching the sun dip below the horizon. The day's work was done, but Thomas's mind was still racing with ideas and questions. You're thinking too hard again, Emily said, nudging him playfully. Thomas smiled faintly. It's hard not to. Every step forward feels like it opens up a dozen more challenges. I just want to make sure we're moving in the right direction. You are, Emily said confidently. You're making a difference, Thomas. And you're inspiring others to do the same. That's how change starts. Thomas looked out at the fading light, a sense of calm settling over him. I hope you're right, he said softly. Emily leaned her head against his shoulder. And I'm here with you, every step of the way. Thomas felt the weight of the journey ahead, but knew that with each step, he was carving a path towards something greater. The crisp envelope sat on Thomas Carter's desk, its official seal catching the light streaming through the window. Emily stood nearby, watching as he carefully opened it. The letter inside bore the signature of the police commissioner, its tone formal yet sincere. Thomas read it aloud, his voice steady. Major General Carter, on behalf of the department, I extend my gratitude for your efforts in holding us accountable and pushing for reform. While this has been a challenging time, your perseverance has been instrumental in starting a conversation long overdue. Change is never easy, but voices like yours make it possible. Sincerely, Commissioner Daniels. Thomas set the letter down and leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. Emily spoke first. It's a good start. Acknowledgement matters. It does, Thomas agreed. But words are the easy part. The real challenge is making sure they follow through. Emily smiled faintly. And you'll be there to remind them, won't you? Thomas gave a small nod. I will, for as long as it takes. Later that afternoon, Thomas stood on the front porch of their home, gazing out at the horizon. The sky was painted in shades of orange and purple as the sun began its slow descent. Emily joined him, handing him a cup of tea and standing by his side. For a moment, they were silent, the weight of everything that had happened lingering between them. Finally, Emily broke the quiet. Do you ever feel like it's too much? She asked. Thomas considered the question, then shook his head. Sometimes it feels overwhelming. But giving up isn't an option. There's too much at stake. Emily glanced at him, her eyes filled with quiet admiration. You've already done more than most people would, Thomas. You've challenged a system that doesn't like being challenged. That takes courage. Thomas sighed, his gaze still fixed on the horizon. Courage isn't enough. It takes persistence, and it takes time. This isn't about quick fixes. It's about building something that lasts. Emily smiled. You've always been good at playing the long game. Thomas chuckled softly. It's a skill I perfected in the military. But this is different. This isn't just about strategy or tactics. It's about people, about trust. And trust takes years to rebuild. Emily leaned against the porch railing. Do you think people are ready for that kind of change? Thomas's expression grew serious. Some will resist it with everything they've got. But the ones who want change, they're the ones I'm fighting for. They're the reason I keep going. The next morning, Thomas met with Angela Wright and the Coalition of Community Leaders once again. Their proposal for independent oversight committees had gained traction, and they were preparing to present it to the city council. Angela handed him a copy of the finalized plan. This is it, she said. Our strongest case yet. If they don't act on this, they're sending a clear message about where they stand. Thomas flipped through the pages, nodding. They'll act, he said firmly, because if they don't, the public won't let them forget it. Angela smirked. You're good at this, rallying people, keeping the pressure on. Maybe you missed your calling as a politician. Thomas shook his head with a slight grin. I've spent enough time in bureaucracies. I'd rather be on the ground, making things happen. Angela nodded. Then let's make this happen. By evening, Thomas and Emily were back on the porch, watching as the day faded into night. The air was cool, carrying with it a sense of renewal. Emily broke the silence. What happens next? Thomas took a sip of his tea, his gaze steady. We keep pushing, one step at a time. It won't be easy, and it won't be quick. But we've started something, and now it's up to us to see it through. Emily nodded. You've always believed in the power of persistence. Thomas smiled. It's the only thing that's ever worked. We can't change everything at once, but piece by piece, step by step, we can build something better. A world where people are treated with the dignity they deserve. Emily reached for his hand, holding it tightly. And you're the one who'll help make that happen. Thomas looked at her, his expression resolute. Not just me. Everyone who believes in this fight. I'm just one voice, but together, we're louder than anything standing in our way. As the last rays of sunlight faded, the American flag in their front yard fluttered gently in the breeze. Its colors stood vivid against the backdrop of the twilight sky. A symbol not just of the past, but of the possibilities still ahead. Thomas watched it for a moment, a quiet sense of hope settling over him. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew this. The fight for justice, for equality, for a better world, was worth every step. Ready to head inside? Emily asked softly. In a minute, Thomas replied, his voice calm and steady. They stood together in the fading light, united by a shared purpose and an unshakable belief in the power of change. And so, Thomas Carter's story reminds us that change, no matter how difficult, begins with courage and persistence. It's a fight not just for justice, but for the hope of building a world where everyone is treated with dignity and fairness. What would you do to stand up against injustice? even when the odds feel insurmountable. If this story inspired you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel for more powerful tales that challenge, motivate, and move us all forward. Together, we can keep these important conversations alive.
The room was silent, except for the faint hum of the fluorescent lights above. Marcus Henderson stood at the head of the long oak conference table, his hands firmly planted on the surface. His eyes scanned the room, a mix of faces, some attentive, some indifferent, and others blatantly hostile. The morning briefing had barely started, but the tension was thick enough to cut with a knife. "Let me make one thing very clear," Marcus said, his voice steady but firm. "This department will not tolerate profiling or misconduct. Period. I don't care how long you've been wearing that badge. I don't care how many arrests you've made. If you cross the line, you'll answer to me." A few officers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, exchanging wary glances. At the far end of the table, Greg Sanders leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, a smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. His body language screamed defiance. "Chief," Greg said, his voice dripping with mock politeness, "with all due respect, maybe you're new here, but this isn't some PR campaign. Out there, it's about survival. We don't have the luxury of second-guessing every decision. You hesitate, you die. That's reality." Marcus straightened, his gaze locking onto Greg's. "Survival doesn't mean abandoning your humanity, Sanders. The people out there are not your enemies. They're our community, and we're here to protect them, not prey on them." Greg let out a short laugh, shaking his head. Spoken like someone who's never had to make a split-second decision in the field. The air grew colder, the room falling into an uneasy silence. Marcus felt the weight of every eye on him, but he refused to let it shake him. He knew Greg's words weren't just about the policy changes he was implementing. This was personal, a challenge to his authority. "You're out of line," Marcus said, his tone sharper now. "If you have an issue with my leadership, you can take it up with me privately. But let me remind you, Officer Sanders, this is not a debate. It's an order." Greg's smirk faltered, but only for a moment. "Understood, Chief," he said, the sarcasm thick in his voice. Marcus held his gaze for a beat longer before turning his attention back to the rest of the room. "Now, let's move on. Patrol assignments for today." Before he could finish, the door to the room swung open, and Officer Angela Ruiz stepped in, her face pale. She hesitated, looking between Marcus and Greg, before speaking. "Chief, there's been an incident. You need to see this." Marcus frowned. "What kind of incident?" Angela glanced at Greg, then back at Marcus. "It's about the checkpoint on Elm Street this morning. There's a video. It's already online." The room buzzed with murmurs as Marcus's stomach tightened. He gestured for Angela to come closer, and she handed him her phone. On the screen was a grainy video, shaky but clear enough to show what had unfolded earlier that day. Greg stood in the center of the frame, his gun raised and pointed at Marcus. The footage didn't capture audio, but the image was damning. Civilians could be seen in the background, their phones up, recording the confrontation. Marcus was in the shot too, standing tall, his hands raised in a calming gesture. The video ended abruptly, but its impact lingered. Marcus set the phone down on the table, his jaw tight. "What the hell is this, Sanders?" he demanded, his voice low but heavy with controlled anger. Greg sat up straighter, his smirk replaced by a defensive scowl. "Chief, that's not the whole story. That kid, he was acting suspicious. I was doing my job. You were the one who stepped in and escalated things." "Escalated?" Marcus's voice rose slightly, his frustration breaking through. "You pointed your weapon at your commanding officer, Greg. Do you have any idea how this looks? To the department? To the public?" Greg shrugged, his defiance returning. "They don't know what it's like out there. Neither do you, apparently. That kid was reaching for something. I don't care what it looks like on video. I wasn't about to let some punk take me out." Marcus took a step closer, his eyes narrowing. "That punk, as you call him, had no weapon. You stopped him without cause. You escalated the situation, and when I stepped in to de-escalate, you pointed a gun at me. You think that's acceptable?" Greg stood up, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. "You're twisting this, Chief. You've had it out for me since day one. I'm just the easy target because I don't fit into your little vision of a reformed department." The room was deathly silent. Every officer was frozen, watching the confrontation with wide eyes. Marcus could feel the weight of their stares, their silent judgment. "You don't fit into this department because you refuse to change," Marcus shot back. "This isn't about you or me, Greg. It's about doing what's right. And if you can't handle that, maybe you're the one who doesn't belong here." Greg opened his mouth to respond, but before he could, Marcus cut him off. "You're suspended, effective immediately. Turn in your badge and your weapon." Greg's face turned red, his hands balling into fists at his sides. "You're making a mistake, Henderson. You think you're a hero, but you're just another suit who doesn't get it. This department is going to eat you alive." Marcus didn't flinch. "Badge. Weapon. No." For a moment, it looked like Greg might refuse. His jaw clenched, his eyes burning with anger. But then, with a muttered curse, he unhooked his badge and gun and slammed them onto the table. "Good luck, Chief," Greg said, his voice dripping with venom. "You're gonna need it." He stormed out of the room, the door slamming shut behind him. Marcus exhaled slowly, the weight of the moment settling on his shoulders. He looked around the room, meeting the eyes of each officer in turn. Some looked away, others stared back with barely concealed skepticism. "This is what accountability looks like," Marcus said finally, his voice steady but tired. "If anyone has a problem with that, my door is always open. But make no mistake, I'm here to change things. And change isn't optional." With that, he turned and left the room, the tension lingering like a storm cloud. In the hallway, Angela caught up with him. "Chief," she said softly, "what are you going to do about the video?" Marcus stopped, running a hand over his face. "I'll handle it," he said, though even he wasn't sure how. The video was already out there, and the damage was done. But something about it didn't sit right with him. As he replayed the confrontation in his mind, a nagging thought began to take shape. The footage wasn't just incriminating. It felt too perfect. The police station was quieter than usual, though the tension in the air felt like a storm about to break. Officers walked the halls with hurried steps, whispering in corners, their eyes darting toward Marcus Henderson's office. Behind the closed door, Marcus sat at his desk, staring at his computer screen. The viral video played on a loop, every frame dissected by his sharp, trained eyes. There was something off. The way the camera had captured the moment so perfectly, Greg pointing his gun, Marcus standing still with his hands raised, it looked too polished. Too clean. Almost staged. But he couldn't pinpoint why, and that only frustrated him further. A knock on the door broke his concentration. "Come in," Marcus said, his voice clipped. Angela Ruiz stepped inside, her expression cautious but resolute. She held a folder in her hands. "Chief, I've been going through the comments and shares on the video," she began, closing the door behind her. "I think you're going to want to see this." Marcus leaned back in his chair, gesturing for her to continue. Angela placed the folder on his desk, flipping it open to reveal a series of screenshots. The video first appeared on a Facebook account that only has one post, this one. No profile picture, no friends, no history. It's a burner account. But here's the strange part. The account was created 3 days ago, before the incident even happened. Marcus's eyebrows knitted together. "Before the incident?" She nodded. "Exactly. And the video wasn't uploaded directly from a phone. It was edited first. The metadata shows it was processed through a video editing program. Someone wanted this to go viral, Chief." Marcus exhaled sharply, the realization sinking in. "Someone's orchestrating this," he muttered. "This isn't just about Greg's actions. It's about undermining me." Angela hesitated for a moment before speaking again. "Chief, I think it's more than that. Whoever did this didn't just want to embarrass you. They wanted to destroy you." The comments under the video are full of coordinated attacks, calling for your resignation, accusing you of being weak, a hypocrite, even corrupt. Marcus rubbed his temples, a familiar ache forming behind his eyes. The job had never been easy, but this felt different. It wasn't just resistance to change, it was sabotage. "Angela," Marcus said, his voice firm despite the weight in his chest, We need to figure out who's behind this. Start by tracking the IP address tied to that burner account. And look into who had access to the checkpoint footage from this morning. Someone inside this department is feeding them material. Angela nodded. I'll get on it right away. As she turned to leave, Marcus called after her. Angela. She stopped, looking back. Be careful who you trust, he said. She nodded again, her expression grave, before slipping out the door. Later that afternoon, Marcus walked into the squad room, his presence commanding immediate attention. Conversations halted, and officers looked up from their desks, some with curiosity, others with thinly veiled resentment. Listen up, Marcus announced, his voice cutting through the room. I know some of you are questioning the decisions I've made, and I know this video has everyone talking. Let me remind you all, I'm here to lead this department into something better. If that makes some of you uncomfortable, so be it. But I won't tolerate division or insubordination. If you've got a problem with me, my door is open. Otherwise, I suggest you focus on doing your jobs. The room was silent, tension rippling through the air like a live wire. Marcus's eyes scanned the room, daring anyone to challenge him. Greg Sanders wasn't there. His absence was a gaping hole in the dynamic, but Marcus knew better than to let it distract him. Greg's suspension had sent shockwaves through the department, and the fallout was only just beginning. As Marcus turned to leave, a voice called out, "Chief." He stopped, turning back. It was Officer Brian Taylor, a younger cop who had always seemed eager to prove himself. His face was set, his tone cautious but firm. "With all due respect," Brian said, his voice steady, "a lot of us feel like we're being kept in the dark. That video's out there, and the whole city's watching. We're the ones on the front lines, and we don't even know what to say when people ask us what happened." There were murmurs of agreement around the room. Marcus stepped closer, his hands resting on his hips. "I understand where you're coming from, Taylor. But this situation is complicated. The investigation is ongoing, and I can't share details until I have the full picture." "That's not good enough," another voice said. This time it was Officer Megan Cartwright, one of Greg's closest allies. "People are calling us racists, thugs. And now they think our own chief doesn't trust us." Marcus's jaw tightened. "Trust is earned, Officer Cartwright. And right now, this department has a lot to prove, to the community and to me. If you think this is hard, imagine what it's like for the people out there who've been dealing with bad policing for years. This isn't about making us comfortable. It's about doing what's right." Megan folded her arms, her eyes narrowing. "Maybe what's right isn't as black and white as you think, Chief." The room fell silent again, the tension palpable. Marcus held her gaze, his expression unreadable. "If you have a problem with the way I lead," Marcus said quietly, his voice razor-sharp, "then I suggest you take it up with me privately. But don't mistake my calm for weakness. I'm here to fix what's broken, whether you're with me or not." With that, he turned and walked out, his footsteps echoing in the quiet room. Back in his office, Marcus sank into his chair, the weight of the day pressing down on him. He stared at his computer screen, the video still paused at the moment Greg's gun was pointed at him. The knock came before he could hit play again. This time, it was Deputy Chief Charles Langston, a grizzled veteran with decades of experience. Langston had always been a neutral presence, respected but reserved. "Got a minute?" Langston asked, stepping inside without waiting for an answer. Marcus nodded, gesturing for him to sit. Langston settled into the chair across from him, his expression unreadable. "Hell of a day," he said, his voice gravelly. "You could say that," Marcus replied, leaning back in his chair. Langston studied him for a moment before speaking. "You're making waves, Chief. Big ones. Not everyone's gonna like it." "I didn't take this job to be liked," Marcus said. "Good," Langston said, leaning forward. "Because whoever leaked that video, they're playing dirty. And I don't think they're done yet." Marcus's eyes narrowed. "You think someone in the department's behind this?" Langston shrugged. "I've been around long enough to know when something doesn't smell right. And this reeks. Someone wants you out of the picture, Marcus. Question is, how far are they willing to go to make that happen?" Marcus didn't respond right away, the weight of Langston's words sinking in. He had always known that change would come with resistance, but this This felt like a war. "Then we find out who it is," Marcus said finally, his voice firm. "And we stop them." Langston nodded, a glimmer of approval in his eyes. "Be careful, Marcus. Not everyone in this building is on your side." As Langston left, Marcus sat in silence, the enormity of the situation pressing down on him. He was fighting not just for his leadership, but for the soul of the department. And somewhere out there, someone was determined to see him fail. The city felt different. It wasn't just the news trucks parked outside the station or the protests gathering at City Hall. It was the way people looked at Marcus Henderson now. Some saw him as a symbol of progress, a man standing up for what was right. But others, especially from within the department, saw him as a threat, a man trying to dismantle a system they believed in, however flawed it might be. Marcus stood by the window in his office, his hands clasped behind his back as he stared out at the growing crowd of protesters down the block. Their chants were faint through the glass, but still clear enough to understand. "Justice for Marcus. Fire the dirty cops." The irony wasn't lost on him. The video, doctored as it was, had painted Greg as the villain, and rightly so for his actions. But the situation was more complicated than the public understood. The truth was still out there, buried under layers of manipulation. Angela Ruiz entered without knocking, her laptop tucked under one arm and a folder in the other. She looked exhausted, her usual sharp focus dulled by sleepless nights spent sifting through endless threads of digital breadcrumbs. "Chief," she said, closing the door behind her. "I've got something." Marcus turned from the window, his face unreadable but his posture tense. "Tell me." Angela sat down across from him, flipping open the laptop and turning the screen toward him. "I traced the IP address tied to the burner account that uploaded the video. It's not conclusive yet, but it leads to a proxy server routed through a coffee shop downtown. More importantly, I found a second account connected to the same proxy, and this one has a little more activity." Marcus leaned closer, his eyes scanning the screen. The account had been posting under a pseudonym, commenting on local news articles and forums, spreading the video while carefully planting narratives that painted Marcus as weak and divisive. "They've been setting this up for weeks," Angela continued. "Whoever this is, they knew exactly how to manipulate the public. The editing, the timing, the fake outrage, it's all coordinated." Marcus's jaw tightened. "And you think this person is inside the department?" Angela hesitated, then nodded. The original video footage, the unedited version, could only have come from the squad car camera at the checkpoint. "I checked the logs. The footage was uploaded to the department's cloud server at 9:13 a.m. By 9:30 a.m., it was downloaded from an internal IP address. 15 minutes later, it was uploaded to the burner account." Marcus's stomach sank. "So, someone in this building..." Angela nodded again. "Someone with access." For a moment, Marcus said nothing, his mind racing. His instincts told him to trust Angela's findings, but the implications were staggering. If someone within his own department was orchestrating this, it meant the rot ran deeper than he'd imagined. Who had access to the footage at that time? Marcus asked finally. Angela hesitated. "That's where it gets tricky. Technically, anyone with the right clearance could have accessed it. But there's a short list of people who would have had reason to pull that specific file so quickly after the incident." She handed him the folder she'd brought in. Inside was a list of names, each one sending a pang of unease through Marcus. One name stood out, Deputy Chief Charles Langston. That evening, Marcus sat across from Langston in the Deputy Chief's cramped office. The man had been with the department for decades, and his gruff demeanor and no-nonsense attitude had made him a trusted figure, at least until now. Langston leaned back in his chair, his expression calm but guarded. "You've got something on your mind, Chief. Out with it." Marcus didn't waste time. The footage from the checkpoint. It was pulled from the server 15 minutes before the edited version showed up online. "Your name's on the access log." Langston's eyes narrowed slightly, but he didn't flinch. "So now I'm a suspect." "I'm asking questions," Marcus said, his voice firm but measured. "Because someone is trying to undermine this department, and I need to know if you're a part of it." Langston let out a dry laugh, shaking his head. "You've got guts, I'll give you that. But you're barking up the wrong tree. I pulled that footage because I was reviewing the incident. Standard procedure, or have you forgotten how this job works?" And did you notice anything unusual in the footage? Marcus pressed. Langston leaned forward, his elbows resting on the desk. Yeah, I noticed something. You stepping in and making a scene. Greg's an ass, but you humiliated him in front of civilians and his team. You escalated just as much as he did. Marcus's jaw tightened. That's not an answer. Langston sighed, his expression hardening. You think I leaked that video? After 30 years in this department, you think I'd risk my reputation to play games? I don't know what to think, Charles, Marcus said, his voice low. But someone in this building wants me gone, and right now, you're not giving me a reason to take you off the list. Langston's eyes darkened, and for a moment, the room was silent. Then, slowly, he stood, his imposing frame casting a long shadow across the desk. You want to fix this department, Marcus? Fine. But you've got no idea what you're up against. You think it's just Greg and a few bad apples? It's deeper than that. There are people, powerful people, who don't want to see you succeed. And if you keep pushing, they'll bury you. Marcus stood as well, refusing to be intimidated. Let them try. Langston smirked, but there was no humor in it. You've got guts, kid. But guts won't save you when the knives come out. As Marcus left Langston's office, his phone buzzed in his pocket. It was Angela. I found something, she said, her voice tense. The second burner account, it just posted again. This time, they uploaded something new. Marcus's heart sank as he pulled the phone from his pocket and opened the link Angela had sent. It was another video, this one a compilation of moments taken out of context. Marcus raising his voice at officers during meetings, community members shouting at him during public forums, and, most damning of all, a moment where he appeared to lose his temper during a tense exchange with Greg weeks before the checkpoint incident. The captions painted a clear narrative, a leader unfit to serve. Marcus stared at the screen, his mind racing. Whoever was behind this wasn't just trying to embarrass him. They were building a case to destroy his credibility entirely. And they were doing a damn good job. The clock on the wall ticked steadily, but Marcus Henderson couldn't feel the passage of time. He sat at his desk, the glow of his phone illuminating his face as he scrolled through comment after comment under the newest viral video. Power hungry. Not fit to lead. Just another politician in a uniform. The word stung, but it wasn't just the public sentiment that weighed on him. It was the fact that someone inside the department, was feeding this narrative. Angela Ruiz entered the room, closing the door carefully behind her. She carried an urgency in her movements, but her expression was wary, as though she were bracing herself for what she was about to say. "Chief," she began, placing a tablet on his desk and turning the screen toward him, "it's worse than we thought." Marcus rubbed his temples, already dreading what he was about to see. "What now?" Angela tapped the screen, bringing up an internal report she had been working on. I cross-referenced the timestamps from the access logs on the checkpoint footage with the department's personnel tracking system. I can't give you a name yet, but I can narrow it down to 2 suspects, Officer Megan Cartwright and IT specialist Tony Delgado. Marcus frowned. Delgado? He's not even a sworn officer. Exactly, Angela said. That's what makes it suspicious. Delgado works in the department's IT division, and his clearance would allow him to access, download, and manipulate footage without raising immediate red flags. But here's the thing. Megan was on patrol that morning, which means Delgado would have needed help getting the footage so quickly. That's where she comes in. Marcus leaned back in his chair, his jaw tightening. You think they're working together? Angela nodded grimly. It's possible. Cartwright's been vocal about her loyalty to Greg Sanders, and Delgado. Well, let's just say he's not exactly a fan of your leadership either. He's been known to make comments in the break room about how you're trying to gut the department with your reforms. Marcus sighed, the weight of the revelation pressing down on him. So, we've got a cop with a grudge and an IT specialist with the skills to make this happen. But why? What do they gain by sabotaging me like this? Angela hesitated before responding. Power. Influence. Maybe even protection. If you're ousted, someone like Greg could rally the old guard and stop the changes you're trying to make. Delgado might see himself as part of that. And Megan? Well, she's clearly willing to take risks to defend people like Greg. Marcus nodded slowly, the pieces falling into place. We need proof, he said finally. Something solid. If we go after them without evidence, it'll look like I'm retaliating against my critics. And that's exactly what they want. Angela gave a curt nod. I'll keep digging. But Chief, you need to be careful. Whoever's behind this isn't just playing dirty, they're dangerous. And if they're willing to manipulate the public like this, they won't hesitate to escalate. I'll handle it, Marcus said, his voice firm despite the uncertainty gnawing at him. That night, Marcus left the station later than usual, his body weary but his mind still racing. The streets were quieter now, the protests having dispersed for the evening, but the tension lingered in the air. As he approached his car, his phone buzzed in his pocket. It was a text message from an unknown number. You don't belong here. Step down, or we'll make sure you regret it. Marcus stared at the screen, his jaw tightening. The message wasn't entirely unexpected. He'd received anonymous threats before, but this one felt more personal. The use of "we" was a chilling reminder that this wasn't the work of a lone disgruntled officer. Sliding into the driver's seat, Marcus quickly forwarded the message to Angela with a note. Track this number. He didn't expect a quick answer. It would take time to trace the sender, but he couldn't afford to let his guard down. As he pulled out of the parking lot, his thoughts returned to the two suspects, Megan Cartwright and Tony Delgado. The more he considered the timeline of events, the more it made sense. Megan had been openly critical of him for months, her loyalty to Greg Sanders evident in her every interaction. Delgado, on the other hand, was quieter, more calculating. Marcus didn't know much about him personally, but Angela's intel painted a picture of a man who preferred to operate from the shadows. The city's streets blurred past as Marcus drove, his mind running through the possibilities. Was Megan the mastermind, using Delgado's technical skills to carry out her plans? Or was Delgado pulling the strings, using Megan as a pawn to access the footage? Either way, Marcus knew one thing for certain: he needed to confront them. The next morning, Marcus called Megan into his office. She arrived with her usual guarded expression, her posture stiff but confident. "You wanted to see me, Chief?" she asked, her tone neutral but with an edge that Marcus couldn't ignore. "Have a seat," Marcus said, gesturing to the chair across from his desk. Megan sat down, crossing her legs and folding her hands in her lap. "I'll get straight to the point," Marcus began, his voice calm but firm. "The video of the checkpoint incident, it was edited and leaked to the public. We have evidence that it was accessed from within the department." Megan raised an eyebrow, her expression unreadable. "And you think I had something to do with it?" "I think you've made it clear where your loyalties lie," Marcus said. "You've been vocal about your support for Greg Sanders, and you've been critical of my leadership. So, yes, I have questions for you." Megan's jaw tightened, but she kept her composure. "With all due respect, Chief, that's a pretty big leap. Just because I don't agree with your policies doesn't mean I'm sabotaging you. And if you're accusing me of something, I'd like to see your proof." Marcus leaned forward, his eyes locking onto hers. "This isn't an accusation, Officer Cartwright. It's an investigation. And until we get to the bottom of it, I need to know that I can trust everyone in this department, including you." Megan met his gaze, her expression hardening. "I've done my job by the book, Chief. If you're looking for someone to blame, maybe you should start with yourself. You've alienated half this department with your so-called reforms, and now you're surprised that people are pushing back." Marcus felt a flicker of anger but kept his tone even. "Reform isn't easy. Change makes people uncomfortable. But that doesn't excuse undermining this department or betraying the trust of the community we serve." Megan stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. "I don't have to sit here and listen to this," she said, her voice cold. "If you want to accuse me of something, put it in writing. Otherwise, I'll be on patrol, doing my job." Without waiting for a response, she turned and walked out, the door slamming shut behind her. Marcus exhaled, his hands gripping the edge of his desk. Megan's reaction had been defensive, but was it genuine outrage or a calculated deflection? Either way, he couldn't afford to let her out of his sight. That afternoon, Angela burst into Marcus's office, her face flushed with urgency. "Chief, we've got him," she said, holding up her phone. "Who?" Marcus asked, standing quickly. "Delgado," Angela said. "I traced the number that sent you the threat last night. It's linked to a burner phone, but I matched the purchase records with Delgado's credit card. He's been covering his tracks, but he slipped up. Marcus's stomach churned. The evidence was damning, but it wasn't over yet. Delgado wasn't the type to act alone. "Bring him in," Marcus said, his voice hardening. "It's time we got some answers." The small interrogation room felt colder than usual, its fluorescent lights casting harsh shadows on the gray walls. Tony Delgado sat at the metal table, his arms crossed, a sheen of sweat glistening on his forehead. Across from him, Marcus Henderson stood with his arms behind his back, his calm demeanor masking the storm brewing inside. Angela Ruiz leaned against the wall, her tablet in hand, ready to back up every piece of evidence they had gathered. Delgado tried to keep his composure, but Marcus could see the cracks forming. "So," Marcus began, his voice measured, "why don't you start by explaining why your credit card was used to purchase a burner phone, which just so happened to send a threat to my personal number last night?" Delgado shifted in his chair, his eyes darting between Marcus and Angela. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said quickly. "This is some kind of mistake." Marcus raised an eyebrow, his expression unflinching. "A mistake?" "We traced the IP address from the burner account that uploaded the doctored checkpoint video. It was routed through the department's proxy server, a server you have full access to. And now we've tied the burner phone to you. Do you really think we're here without evidence?" Delgado swallowed hard, his confidence slipping further. I don't know how that happened," he stammered. "Someone must have used my credentials. I didn't leak anything." Angela stepped forward, her tablet lighting up as she tapped the screen. "Your login credentials were used to access the footage 15 minutes after it was uploaded to the department server," she said, her tone sharp. "You downloaded it, edited it, and uploaded it to the burner account. Don't even try to deny it. We have the logs." Delgado's face turned red, his hands gripping the edge of the table. "I'm not the only one who had access to that footage," he snapped. "If you're so damn sure it was me, why don't you look at everyone else?" Marcus stepped closer, his voice lowering but carrying more weight. "We already did. And all the evidence points to you. But here's what I really want to know. Why? What was your motive, Tony? Who put you up to this?" Delgado clenched his jaw, his eyes narrowing. For a moment, it seemed like he might stay silent. But then, his defiance cracked. "You think you're some kind of savior, don't you?" he spat. "Coming in here, turning everything upside down, making everyone feel like they're the problem. You don't belong in this department, Henderson. You never did." Marcus didn't flinch. "That's not a motive. That's an excuse. Who else is involved?" Delgado hesitated, his eyes darting toward the door as if calculating an escape route. Finally, he exhaled sharply and leaned back in his chair, his expression a mix of anger and resignation. "It wasn't just me," he admitted. "Cartwright helped. She gave me the footage. But it wasn't her idea." Marcus's eyes narrowed. "Then whose idea was it?" Delgado hesitated again, his hands fidgeting on the table. "Sanders," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "Greg Sanders. He came to me weeks ago, said he needed my help to send a message. Said you were destroying the department, making us weak. He convinced Megan to get the footage and bring it to me. I didn't want to do it, but Greg, he's persuasive." Angela exchanged a quick glance with Marcus, her expression hardening. Marcus's voice dropped, colder now. "Where is Greg now?" Delgado shook his head. "I don't know. I haven't talked to him since the video went up. He said he'd handle things from here." Marcus straightened, his jaw tight. "Handle what, Tony? What's his next move?" Delgado looked genuinely terrified now. "I don't know," he said, his voice trembling. "I swear, Chief. I don't know. He just said this wasn't over." By the time Marcus left the interrogation room, his mind was racing. Angela followed closely behind, her tablet clutched tightly in her hands. "Greg's on the run," Angela said, her tone urgent. "We need to put out a bolo and alert the department." Marcus nodded, his face grim. "Do it. And send an alert to the precinct captains. Tell them to stay on high alert. Greg's unpredictable, and we don't know how far he's willing to go." Angela paused, hesitating for a moment. "Chief," she said quietly, "if Greg really believes he's doing this to save the department, He might target you directly. Marcus met her gaze, his expression steady despite the weight of her words. Let him, he said. This ends now. That evening, Marcus returned to his office, the station buzzing with activity as officers scrambled to track Greg's movements. Reports came in from neighboring precincts, but there was no sign of him. Marcus sat at his desk, his eyes scanning the files Angela had compiled on Greg, his service record, disciplinary history, and notes from their time working together. A knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. It was Angela again, her face pale. "Chief," she said, stepping inside, "we found something." She placed a printout on his desk. It was a screenshot from a private message Greg had sent to Megan Cartwright the night before the video was leaked. The message was short but chilling. "If Henderson won't step down, we'll give him a reason to. Meet me at the warehouse on 9th. Marcus's stomach twisted. The warehouse on 9th Street was an abandoned facility on the edge of town, a place notorious for illegal activity. "I'm going," Marcus said, standing abruptly. Angela's eyes widened. "Chief, you can't." "I'm not waiting for Greg to make the next move," Marcus said firmly. "If he's there, this ends tonight. Call for backup, but tell them to hang back until I give the signal." Angela hesitated, but the determination in Marcus's eyes left no room for argument. She nodded reluctantly. "Be careful," she said. The warehouse was dark and quiet, its rusted exterior illuminated only by the faint glow of the moon. Marcus stepped out of his car, his hand resting on the holster at his side. He approached the building cautiously, his footsteps echoing against the cracked pavement. Inside, the air was damp and heavy, the faint smell of mildew lingering in the shadows. Marcus moved through the maze of empty crates and broken machinery, his senses on high alert. "Marcus." The voice came from the far end of the room. Greg Sanders stepped out from the shadows, a gun in his hand but pointed at the ground. His face was a mix of anger and exhaustion, his usually confident demeanor now tinged with desperation. "You shouldn't have come here alone," Greg said, his voice low. Marcus stopped a few feet away, his hands at his sides. "You wanted my attention, Greg. Now you've got it." Greg laughed bitterly, shaking his head. "You don't get it, do you? This isn't about you and me. This is about the department. About survival. You think your reforms are fixing things, but all you're doing is tearing us apart." Marcus's voice was calm but firm. "What I'm doing is holding us accountable. What you're doing is trying to drag us back into the past." Greg raised his gun, his hand trembling slightly. "You've turned everyone against me," he said, his voice breaking. "I gave my life to this job, and now I'm the bad guy." "You did that to yourself," Marcus said, taking a careful step closer. "But it's not too late to make it right. Put the gun down, Greg." For a moment, Greg hesitated, his grip on the weapon faltering. The tension in the air was almost unbearable. Then, with a shaky exhale, Greg lowered the gun and dropped it to the ground. His shoulders slumped, the fight draining out of him. Sirens wailed in the distance as backup arrived, the sound growing louder with each passing second. Marcus stepped forward, placing a firm hand on Greg's shoulder. "It's over," Marcus said quietly. Greg didn't respond, his eyes fixed on the ground. In the days that followed, the department began to stabilize. Greg's arrest marked a turning point, a signal that no one was above accountability, not even those who had once been considered untouchable. Delgado and Megan were also placed under arrest, their roles in the conspiracy laid bare for all to see. For Marcus, the road ahead was still long. The scars left by the ordeal would take time to heal, both for the department and the community. But as he stood at the podium during a press conference, addressing the city he had sworn to serve, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. "Change isn't easy," Marcus said, his voice steady and resolute. "But it's necessary. And it's worth fighting for." The crowd erupted into applause, but Marcus knew the real work was just beginning. And he was ready for it.